Fantastic. So I've been nominated to talk about dissemination, exploitation, and communication. I will do it quickly. I've got my own version of what Heidi did at the beginning, so if everyone can stand up. Stand up. There we go. I was worried about doing this before lunch. I think doing it after lunch might be worse, but we'll see. So I get the impression we've kind of got a feeling for who's here, but just sit down if you haven't ever been involved in preparing a grant funding application. Ooh, very good. And if you've not prepared a European one, okay. Sit down if you haven't been involved in being the primary writer or part of the primary writing team for a bid. Whoa, wow, this is a group of experts. So then sit down if you haven't coordinated a bid and the writing of it. Oh, and finally, no worries. And then finally, sit down if you've not been able to win a bid while writing and coordinating it. Yeah, just for EU ones. This is good. I did this in a thing for 200 people, and literally everyone sat down at the end, and I was like, so I'm an expert about going. First hint, you should talk to these guys, because they're the ones who know how to do this. So please sit down, thanks. But it gives me a good idea. So actually, we have got a group of fairly experienced people here, which is fantastic. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. I've never been an EC evaluator, but I do speak to them a lot. So I will often refer to what evaluators think. That's not from personal experience, that's from gathering information from people. These views are my own, as opposed to being TWI's or anybody else's. The reason I agreed to do this was because my job is to, I'll come to my job in a second, but is to help put these kind of proposals together. And I haven't looked at this part of the proposal for several years. At the beginning of H2020, I sort of looked at what changed between FP7 and H2020, but I've not really sat down to analyse what proposals look like. So I pulled the last sort of 3 years of proposals that TWI have been involved in that have been successful, which is about 20 odd proposals, and started to read the exploitation dissemination sections to try and see what things seem to work versus what doesn't. And then the last thing, actually, the way I've structured most of this presentation is literally just going through the EC guidelines, which are actually quite good. They're rubbish if you kind of just look at them and just read it, but actually trying to analyse what they're getting at and how that will feed into your proposal is actually quite useful. So having said all of that, I made you stand up. Yeah, probably go, who the hell is this guy? He doesn't know anything about writing proposals. So that's me. I'm the European Funding Coordinator for Joining Technologies at TWI. That was me before I had kids as well, just if I look younger. To try and unpack that, I put the last time I tried to get jobs, so I went to my LinkedIn profile. And during FP7, apparently, I helped secure about 20 million quid worth of funding for companies I was working for on a consultancy basis. I'm not sure where it is in Horizon 2020. It's probably a bit more than that, I suspect, working with TWI. And I'm responsible for putting together about sort of 30 to 50 projects with the help of researchers at TWI for doing this. So I think that's probably why Craig asked me to come and talk about this a little bit. And we're relatively successful at this, certainly in the innovation actions, very sort of closer to market instruments. So what I'm going to talk about, set a little bit of context, because yeah, as you say, we mentioned exploitation, dissemination, and communication in passing a few times already today. But understanding where this fits in the proposal and why we're talking about it, to find some terms here, just to make sure we're all on the same page, and then go through the three elements, and then get a bit of a summary. So the context. What I'll do is I'll pause it as I'm going through each of these bits and sort of try and save up questions at that point, because there will be questions through this. I've got 20 minutes of talking and then hopefully 15 minutes to deal with issues and learn off each other a little bit here. So why do we need to do this? It's a mandatory part of the proposal. Section 2.2 is what we're talking about, for those not intimately familiar. This makes up about half of your impact section. And in many mechanisms, as we talked about this morning, evaluators are told to either start with the impacts or they are ranked higher in terms of the scoring. It's also interesting, there's about 2 pages of notes on what you should include in this part of the proposal, as opposed to 2 bullet points for section 2.1, which is the expected impacts. So, and the critical thing for me here is this explains not so much what, but certainly why and how your project is going to make a difference in the world, which is absolutely critical for convincing an evaluator that you're the proposal to take forward and give the money to. So I'll come back to this many times, because if there's one thing, being it's post-lunch, you want to write down, that's it. These slides will be available as PDFs, so there's lots of slow reveal things, because that's how I like presenting, but but that's the critical thing here, is how is your proposal going to make a difference in the world, sort of post-project, ultimately. So, just again, set some context. Where are we in the document? That should be familiar to most people in terms of the structure of an H2020 proposal for a RIA or an IA. You're looking at 15 to 20 pages for section 1, same for section 2, and then the balance in section 3. For FTI, which is something that TDI do a lot of, this is the fast track to innovation mechanism, and there's only 30 pages, so you're looking at more like that in terms of page counts. So we're sort of in the middle. I was thinking about how to describe this, and the reason why I thought this was important to mention, because I reckon you're about 60 or 70% of the way through your proposal. And what I mean by that is, depending on evaluators either start reading at section 2 or at section 1, but they'll start reading your proposal to try and understand what your project is about. Call that a little bit less than 15 minutes. Then they want to understand the impacts, so a little less than 10 minutes. But by the point they read section 2.2, your dissemination and exploitation, they've probably been looking at this for something like 20 minutes, and they are probably bored. Or they're not paying as much attention as they were when they started reading it. And bearing in mind, if this is their 5th proposal in their batch that they are looking at, you've really got to start trying to stand out. And the critical thing there to realise is they're not necessarily going to dive into the detail straight away the first time they look through it. What they want to know is that you've got the detail and that they can refer back to it once they've read through everything, and then we'll go back to either help win the proposal or look for reasons to fail it. And again, you've got to make it crystal clear, bearing in mind that this is not going to be their primary interest here, is by communicating it across, you've got to explain why and how your proposal is going to make a difference in the world. Like the what is good, that's section 1 primarily, but why and how. So the critical take-home point here is you've got to keep it really accessible. And lots of signposting. I think people probably understand that, especially if you're in academic world. It's kind of make sure people know where to find the right information. Okay. Everyone clear on context? Any questions about that? Good. Is anyone paying attention? That's might be a better question. So diving into the purpose and some definitions. So section 2.2, measures to maximize impact, split into 2 parts, A and B. I'm talking here primarily about RIAs and IAs, and this is the general template for those mechanisms. CSAs, it's the same, but it's slightly different content. So just to say that now. If you look at the guidance, there are essentially 5 bullet points that say that you need to include a plan. It then says you need a business plan if relevant. I've never come across a successful proposal that doesn't have a business plan, so I would suggest it is very relevant for any kind of proposal. Even if it's a research-heavy topic, you still need a very clear way of which it's going to make a difference in the world. So definitely for an IA, and I wouldn't change it very much for an RIA, to be honest. And it certainly needs to cover what the commercial partners are doing in a project. The data management and knowledge management, which Paul referenced briefly. I wasn't quite sure what he was going to say about it, so I put it here. But there's 2 bullet points on that out of your 5. And I've got no slides on it, which is a bit bizarre. But if you want to ask questions about that, we can do that at the end. And then there's a bullet point on communication measures. So let's go through defining some terms. So dissemination of results is what we're talking about here. So the EC say, show how your proposed measures is going to help you achieve the expected impacts of the project. That's fairly straightforward. So show how you are going to do it. So you need to explain some steps here, or you've got to show how it's going to be done. Exploitation of results. Again, this is the 4 innovation actions specifically. Describe a credible path to deliver these innovations to market. And so that's showing how, again, you're going to reach market. I prefer to think of it as the light of day when I'm talking to researchers about projects and helping to kind of respond to topics like we did this morning, is kind of how's this going to make a difference? What's the final end state going to look like? So you've really got to think about these things. Communication, so that's simply promoting the project and its findings during the grant agreement. So yeah, just to make it clear, the Times Roman squiggly font, that's direct quotes from the EC guidance, and my other bits are my interpretation or what it means there. Oh, yeah, and this one is really, what is it you're going to do in the project to promote the project? And what an evaluator, I think, is trying to get at, and certainly what the EC are looking for, is ensuring that you have some appetite to shout about the project to make sure everyone's heard about it, because obviously there's a lot of money being given out here with not a huge amount of discernment, you might argue. And the EC are getting more and more conscious of the fact that citizens are not seeing the benefit of this, and they want bigger programs that are more publicised and that under normal people, like imagine your mum and explaining your project to your mum and making sure that they understand it. Okay, purpose and definitions. Everyone happy with that? Anyone want to correct me? Because that's just what I pulled out. Or is it still too close to lunch and everyone's quiet? So anyway, I'm going to jump down to communication now, because that's much easier to talk about than the first two. I will do that in a second. So the one bullet point you get on communications in terms of guidance is sort of split into three parts. So there's promoting the activities to promote the project during the grant agreement. Your measures should be proportionate to the size and scale of the project. Yeah, fair enough. And it needs to be tailored to different types of audiences. Ooh. There should be a bit under there that says, this is all quite obvious, and you just need to do it and follow this advice. There's not a huge amount more to say, perhaps, on this. Typically, what this ends up looking like in a proposal, if that's what people sort of cutting to the answer, is you need to list a bunch of channels and or strategies at how you're going to reach people is probably the critical point here. You often end up something that looks like this, a nice table. It's got some channels. So this is things like websites and social media and events, conferences and so on. A description of what you're going to do with relation to those channels and who you are trying to target. This one for this was from a successful proposal. So I'm pulling examples from successful proposals, or where I think one in a failed proposal is a better example of it, but obviously wasn't necessarily the reason why it failed. This one was 2 pages long for quite a big project. It might have been a €12 million project, I can't remember, but yeah, so just to give you an idea of how much focus it gets. That's sort of your basic answer to the communication question, or the communication part of the proposal. You can get a little bit more sophisticated. This table is from, again, another successful proposal. Here you have a communication objective. So if you've got marketing people or people with marketing experience will realise that is a more sensible way to look at this. You've then got a list of stakeholders and then the methods for actually trying to get hold of them. So this is a slightly better way of doing it. Bear in mind, the last one was 2 pages long, this one is 7 lines. And also the only unique thing about this is the bit highlighted in yellow, really. So whether it's right, but what this is another good example of is signposting, because that's roughly what it looked like on the page. I couldn't be bothered to go through and redact it, I'm afraid, so I just blurred it out. But you can quite clearly see it sits on one page. An evaluator knows that you've got a communication thing there. They can go straight to that page if they want to question it. This proposal had these groups of stakeholders, which I thought was a really weird way of doing it, but I'd have just written down, given those groups names rather than numbers, but space is a problem and so on. But that's a good example of how you could do it. And then one last example that was pretty good. The perfect example, perhaps? I don't know. Again, you've got a table. These are the column headings. So it just breaks those things down into a little bit more. And you've got these last 2 columns, which is when and evaluation. So they also coupled it with this table, which had a bunch of indicators as to how they were going to achieve these impacts and make sure that, or what they were anticipating these methods of communication would achieve. So this was 4 pages long, this section, so it was probably a bit long and not particularly well signposted, but it was very detailed. It has some targets and, like I said, some time links, which is great. Although on this one, if if you notice, that's got trends in website visits, and by the end of the project they want 5,000 website visits, and then they want to go to 10,000, and then 10,000, while simultaneously growing their growth from 2 to 18 to 40%. So if you are going to put detail in, make sure it's correct and makes some kind of sense, because that doesn't make any sense why those website visits would lead to those revenue growths or be in any way related. Ooh. So that's all I was going to say about communication. Any questions about that? Go on, Stafford. Throw me a soft one.
Like I say, a lot of what you just presented looks quite refined, almost like it's being done by somebody that might do that kind of thing for a job rather than somebody jobbing at it like I used to. Is it typical, maybe in a consortium, to say, right, you're in charge of comms, for example? Thinking about roles like we were earlier.
So for a bigger RAIA, say north of 6 million euros, it's a good idea to pick up a partner that specialises in exploitation dissemination. Perhaps. I suspect there'll be examples both ways in the room. Sometimes they're really good, sometimes they're rubbish. They will have a lot of pre-populatable templates, substructures for this kind of stuff. But this stuff isn't complicated. I mean, if you've got marketing teams, maybe the small companies don't, but there's loads of stuff on web about marketing channels. Get a list, put it in a table, write down how you're going to use this to reach people. Everyone uses social media. Everyone knows what a website looks like. This stuff is not rocket science. Considering that the first part you proposal is probably a bit more rocket science-y, you'd have thought. So, yeah, that's what I'd say to that.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
It is quite easy. From my experience, it's also quite hard work. What's as you just volume sometimes of managing stuff, it's quite time-consuming. So think about resources in a project. What's typical from your experience about how much might be allocated to communication dissemination activities?
Oh, that is a good question. That comes back to where the other work package on exploitation that Paul was talking about a little bit. And my rule of thumb there would be to ensure that the commercial companies have a proportion of their time, maybe 5%, 10% of their effort in that area, because you would imagine that the companies in a bid are the ones that are most interested in doing this activity. Therefore, if they've got no efforts allocated in the proposal to it or in the project to it, then how are they actually going to do that within the context of the consortium and the nice happy family that you've portrayed in your proposal document? So that's like 5-10% of the effort of a company. Researchers probably a little bit less on the basis they're doing more research effort perhaps, but something like that. I mean, in FP7 it used to be 7% for management time, with exploitation and dissemination on top of that. So that was removed in Horizon 2020. So you can use it as a benchmark level. What evaluators are still expecting to see, something like that. So, anyone want to say anything about that or disagree with that? No? Okay. Right, I'll move on in the interest of time. So let's get into the guts of the exploitation dissemination, which I spent a little bit of time trying to do like this and then decided that it was silly and actually we need to do them together. I think when we were going through the definition point, I don't really understand what the difference between these two things are. There's a sort of a dissemination as an academic exercise, exploitation is a more commercial exercise, but the two things here are so intimate, it's very difficult to separate them, and it's in the same section in the proposal. So I'll talk about these together. So we'll go back to the EC guidelines. Like I said, I'm going to refer to these a lot. It is in bold that you should put a plan for dissemination and exploitation of the project results. Okay, great. It then tells you a bit about what you should put in this plan, proportionate to the scale of the project. Yep. Should contain measures both during the project and after the project. And then it says, for innovation actions, please describe a credible path to market. I underline this please because as I was reading this and going through it in some detail, it sounded a bit human from the EC. It's like, please give us a plan. And I see so many proposals across my desk where someone hasn't actually explained what they're going to do and how they're going to structure this. So there's no way an evaluator can then make an assessment on it. And if you haven't presented it, then they can't give you a positive mark against that, essentially. So make sure it's very clear and I think this sort of please is a call to that, or it certainly resonated with me when I saw it. And again, this is all pretty sensible. You should definitely do all of these things. I don't think anybody would disagree. But there's more. For some reason, and I don't understand this, and if anyone can shed light, there is a big hazard sign in the EC guidance. And in fact, there's not just one hazard sign, there are 3 hazard signs just in this section of the proposal as guidance. And it's like, why have they put a hazard sign there? Beyond me, but I'm going to assume it's relatively important. Why it couldn't be bullets like the rest of the section, who knows? But having gone through these in more detail than I probably have done for several years, they're actually pretty important points here. They're just badly presented in the guidance. So I'll break it down and then show examples of where you should do this or how you should do this. So the first bit is the area in which you expect to make an impact. Should be kind of obvious, so you've got to specify what your target market and sectors are. Hopefully that's news to no one. But a lot of proposals I come across don't. They'll say, we're going to hit the aerospace sector, or we're going to hit the automotive sector. And it's like, that's very big. And you've got some little technology here. You've got to break it down more than that, is the only thing I would add to that. Can be hard to get these numbers, but that's what you've got to do. This is particularly important for the closer to market actions, because you've got to have that credible plan to take it to market. If you don't have this kind of level of detail, you do not have credibility in the eyes of an industrial evaluator or someone who's assessing the value for money. For people that do the fast track to innovation mechanism, this can actually be quite difficult, because the impact part of fast track to innovation is about achieving growth and jobs. So actually a lot of this stuff ends up in section 2.1. So that's another point here, is that actually the structuring of this part of the proposal is quite fluid. Hence the signposting is quite tricky, because the evaluator might go to section 2.2 expecting to see some information that you've actually got in section 2.1. So you've got to make it really clear and try and get that structure presented. Like I said, that's more for the FTI mechanism. It's quite short anyway, but just to flag that out in case that's a problem. Back to the guidance. So who are the potential users of your results? So if you work for a company, that would be a customer, is what everybody else would call it. But actually, the rule of thumb I use here is end users get talked about a lot. So that's people like, if you're talking about aerospace, that would be Airbus, the guys that make the planes in Europe. But actually, there's a big group of people that often get missed out, or there's 2 other groups of people that get missed out. And that's what I describe as consumers. So if you go on an aeroplane, you don't really care how it was made, as long as it flies and is as comfortable as it can possibly be. That doesn't cost you lots of money. So you are a consumer of the output of a project, potentially. And then you've got sponsors and purchasers. Sponsors is a project management term, which many of you will be familiar with. So it's who's paying for this, and how does the money go around work is a very good way of analysing this part of the proposal. And then, like I said, you've got actual customers within a supply chain. So an example of how you might go about doing this was for an SME instrument proposal. But this SME was creating the system. They were going to then supply it to some target customers. This was aerospace manufacturers. Those guys get a benefit in 2 ways. They can reduce their costs and they can improve their products. They can then attack the global aerospace market. So you've got your £100 billion a year global aerospace market. You've got some big customers here, and a couple of these guys wrote letters of support for this proposal as well, so they had an even more credibility tie-in here. And then this company is trying to sell some funky kit for about, I don't know, they might make £10 million to £50 million within 5 years, something like that. But that's how you've tied the developments in your project to the really big market in a really clear to understand way, and that's what you need to do here. Okay, a little bit more breakdown on all those little hazard points. So how do you intend to use your appropriate channels of dissemination with users? So they call it users. I'm pretty sure most people in the room would call those stakeholders, because they then go on and identify 9 groups of stakeholders, but they're calling them users for some reason. So stakeholders are important here as well. So you need, on all the successful proposals that we've got, these are very clearly defined who the groups are, what their interests are. So I had a really cool graphic that I came across in one of the slides in preparing this, but I then couldn't find it when I came to insert it. So unfortunately, there's just a list. I think this is from a generic business planning training session I was in. But there are loads of potential stakeholders for your project, like I said. You can use the rule of thumb, ones that I mentioned a second ago, but you should probably tie into those. And for those who are sort of Brits here who don't travel a huge amount, which is probably not many of you, but actually trade unions is something that comes up quite a lot. I think people who are not native British will kind of, in the UK, you either hate trade unions because you're a conservative or you sort of love them a little bit if you're a Labour person. But in continental Europe, they have a far more healthy relationship with their industries, and they should be a stakeholder that's going to, if you're going to affect jobs or rock an industry slightly, those guys are quite important stakeholders that you should probably mention. And the other person that I haven't mentioned here are actually the project partners so far. Kind of goes without saying, but these are the guys who are going to provide the solution, normally in some kind of supply chain or value chain within the consortium to get your product, process, technology idea to see the light of day. So those are stakeholders. Sorry if I'm running through this quite quick, but you can look at it afterwards if you wish. So you obviously then need to give consideration to what you're going to do after the project, for the avoidance of doubt. And this flies a little bit in the face of what Paul said. That is not, this probably falls to the university partners or university representatives in the room. This is not the how is this project going to lead to another European project. You can have that as part of a sort of, it will lead to new endeavours or new investigations into a given field. That's fine, and that might lead into spin-out projects, but that should certainly not be your focus of doing this project, so you can then do another project, unless it's moving from an RIA into a closer to market instrument, perhaps. But so that's something I have to say for the TWI guys, because we're a research technology organisation, and everyone thinks that this programme exists to fund us, and it really doesn't. Like I said, so you need to give an indication of where this is all going. Like, this is absolutely critical for this exploitation dissemination section. So what that means in reality is, for the business partners, you need to do some kind of financial forecast and include that within your section 2.2. Like I said, I've blurred these out, but essentially, hopefully everyone's familiar with what this would be. This is revenues, some costs, and then some kind of profit breakdown. And it's projected into the future a number of years post-project. I was musing about, do you need to do this? No, everyone you ever win definitely has this. It's mostly made up, so I'm a sort of more of an engineering sciencey kind of with an academic background, so I don't like this very much because it is not made up, but it's definitely guessy. This one's a better example because these bits refer to the list of results of the project. So a good way to start with section 2.2 is a list of what you're actually going to output, and I think that's what you'll get if you do Paul's analysis for the IPR stuff. So this had literally how those then fit into products. You're going to sell some of those products, you're going to make some money, and this was a €6 million project that was normally going to make £300 million pounds, or 300 million euros potentially. Like I said, this one then has at the bottom, like I said, you can't see it unfortunately, but this is a post-project investment by the partners. So they're going to demonstrate a prototype in the project. They then need to build a factory and get it out into the world that way. So they weren't going to make any money for the first 3 years, but from years 3 to 5, they were going to rake it in, is kind of what this was saying. But that then becomes a credible route to market, not just a sort of a fanciful thing. Okay. This then moves us on to timelines, and like I said, explaining...
Instead of just including the table for that, could you also include a graph that's, a lot of times that's more visual, whether you're showing where those different expectations are for the spend?
That's a good idea, yep. I would suggest that. I've got an example of it just here, so that's why I'll jump onto this. So yeah, so you need to indicate when stuff's going to happen. So at least put in something simple like a little Gantt chart. So this is kind of post-project investment activities relating to that previous one, the partners that are going to be involved in doing it and when they're going to do it. It's much better to put the actual years on rather than year 1, year 2, year 3, because that makes, again, more credible that you're actually thinking about doing this. So these are the various activities that we're going to undertake, raising finance, building facilities and so on. And actually, graphics and charts are much better here. And actually, within TWI, we write the proposal ourselves, predominantly-ish. But if we spend any money on proposal, actually, it's on this kind of bit to involve a graphic artist because you can start creating diagrams. This was just done in PowerPoint, but this was an Innovate UK proposal or project. But it started with an investigation feasibility study, went to the big project, moving up the TRL, doing some technology stuff, and then it's going to move into some sectors. That's a pretty nice way of signposting how this is going to work and what the idea of the exploitation is. If you start getting some graphic guys involved, you can do something a bit more sophisticated. So this sort of said where the idea came from. The project sort of sat in here, and then was going to do some stuff subsequently. And yes, you've got a nice little graph of explaining how that's going to turn into some euros and cents. And like I said, you can then, in the vein of the first one, you can actually put some numbers and show how you can progress. So this was a project that was going to lead to 3 different markets or 3 different elements in a market. So like I said, doing these kind of graphic-y things makes it very easy for an evaluator to see it. They can probably read it really fast, so when they're sort of going for the first time, they get it. And then they can refer back to it to look at the detail and the text around it. It goes into that. Right, I'll skip over this really quickly. Has anyone come across, who's come across the business model canvas? So you need to plan all of this. You need to answer Paul's questions with regard to the IPR, because that will sit within this section as well, and I didn't talk about it because Paul was going to deal with the strategy parts of it, and I've not really gone into the mechanics of it. But this is a really cool tool that looks at what you're actually all about. So in the middle, you have sort of what you're doing, your value proposition is the sort of modern way of saying that. Left-hand side is everything you need to make that happen, so that should be people within your project or resources that you need to tap into. On the right-hand side, it's your customers, how you're going to get to them, and what problem you're solving for them, and then what revenues you'll generate. So that's kind of how it works. That's what the template looks like. That's the book. So if you want to understand this, there's a great YouTube video for 10 minutes that explains how this works. But if you're struggling with this section or want to know how to pull it together, you should try filling in something like this. I've seen it included in proposals, which is not great necessarily, but as a planning tool to make sure you've covered all the elements, it's very good. Institute for Manufacturing, where I stole some of these slides, they advocate get a big board and some post-it notes and stick it all around, which is okay. But you can then start to turn this into a graphical communication thing as well. So, someone's good at sketching. This was one they gave an example for Skype. And before they were bought by Microsoft. But so that's a great way if you're struggling in this and want a way of how do I structure this cells. So go on, questions about that bit?
Normally use the business model canvas for startup projects or lean startup approach processes. To be honest with you, it would be great actually to use one of these, the approach within a project, but it's probably impossible because the way, if you are in charge of writing a proposal, there's just one person, a group of 2-3 people, and they don't communicate with the other partners. Definitely, there would be unless there's something that you are reapplying for a proposal that's been rejected, and you team up together, you commit some resources, but generally speaking, it takes a little bit of time to go through an innovation workshop, if you want to use this term, and it would be amazing actually if someone can scale this project and can, let's say, help other groups in order to apply funding using this approach. That would be amazing. It should be.
So what I'd say to that is, when I'm talking about using the business model canvas, I'm saying do it for your project, not for your partners. So your value proposition, so your project's going to be producing something. It's got a strap line. Heidi talked about defining the need, and you're going to produce some technology and some kind of product or service that's going to service that. You've got to make sure that that's your value proposition. You've then got to make sure that all those elements come together, because if you don't, you're really going to struggle to write your exploitation and dissemination strategy, because you'll be like, it's just not going to make sense. Whereas if you can get it all to work, and because you'll help identify missing partners, missing relationships, because not all those bits have to have partners associated with them, but they have to have links to organisations and so on. So when we were talking about that topic this morning, that's the call this morning, and having some kind of way of testing it, a municipal council or Uber or someone like that, like you would identify that you'd need that in order to do that via that template. Like I said, I figured that some people might want a sort of, how do I go and do this? So that's a pretty good place to start if you want to kind of figure these things out. Thank you. Any other questions? It's pretty much everything. I'll just jump into the data management, the 2 bullet points out of your 5 that you get. Of the 20 plus proposals I saw, there were only 2 that had more than a page written about it, and most of them just had a sort of throwaway paragraph. So for those people that don't understand that area, this is just the EC trying to say that we've funded public research. We don't want it to be hoarded in companies. We want it to go into open access publications and the data to be available for other groups to access because it's been paid for by Europe. You should, if it's possible within your project, try and make that available, and then you have to write sort of how you're going to do that, what the agreements, the IPR access rights and so on will be there. So depending on your project, that will be more or less relevant. If you're patenting things and commercially trying to exploit things in an IA, most of that stuff can be, no, we're not going to give anything away because it's all important and we might be shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to making money or invalidating a patent or something like that. So that's why there's not much on that. So last slide. Like I said, you need to, in your whole proposal, and especially in this section, explain what, why, and how your project is going to make a difference in the world. Absolutely critical, because if an evaluator likes your idea, or even if they don't like your idea, but they can see how it can all work through to drive the impacts and give benefits to Europe, that puts you in a really good position to get retained. And then the last thing that I haven't said a huge amount about, but like I said with the business model canvas stuff, that if you've got a good project with the right people doing the right things, writing this section should be quite straightforward. You'll have a clear list of outputs and results and a clear way of taking them to market. So actually, lots of people come to me going like, oh, how do I fix this? And it's like, well, you need a partner to do this. And like, oh, we're already full. We can't bring anybody else in. It's like, well, you're in trouble there. You've got to plan this from the beginning and have this in mind, because if you don't have this, and you come to write this, the part of the proposal, having written quite a lot of the rest of it typically, then you're going to be in real trouble. Okay. That's me. If you want to ask me any follow-up questions, and like I said, the slides will be available in the PDF afterwards.